Hello, my name is Jeremy Cunningham. I'm a drummer, composer, and improviser living in Chicago, Illinois. Thank you so much to Andy Crawford and the Jerome Mirza residency and the student body. They've given me the opportunity to share my thoughts and ideas with you today. I'd like to talk a little bit about myself before getting into my topic today in this lecture, because I think that a little background information sort of helps tell a story, and I think it gives, especially young musicians, sort of an insight into where a person came from, and there might be parallels in their own lives that they can draw upon um, for inspiration and commonalities. So I was born in Cincinnati, Ohio, um, and no one in my family really was a musician, a professional musician. People had dabbled in different instruments. My aunt played the flute. I think my dad tried to play the violin. Um, but no one was a professional musician. Father's a chef, and my mom was a stay-at-home mom. And when I think back to some of the early memories I have of music in my life, the first thing I think about are lullabies that my mother would sing to me when I was an infant. And then after that memory, the next one that is really sort of indelible is as a 3 year old or so watching the Apple logo on a Beatles record spinning around as the song Dear Prudence plays. And I loved that song when I was a kid. I loved the bass line, I loved the drum groove. I was totally fascinated with that sound. My mother and father had a great record collection that spanned many different styles: Joni Mitchell, the Rolling Stones, and my dad had Pink Floyd records, and he also had Creed Taylor records. And these Creed Taylor records had amazing musicians like Herbie Hancock, Billy Cobham, George Benson, Milt Jackson, and these really lush arrangements by Don Sebesky. And I remember listening to all these sounds and just loving the variety and just how expansive all of these different things were and how they all kind of lived in their own space. When I was a little bit older and finally started to buy my own music as a middle schooler, the first tape that I bought was a Jimi Hendrix Greatest Hits tape. Um, because I just loved these drum fills that Mitch Mitchell was playing, and I loved Jimi Hendrix just soaring over the top with his guitar, and I loved his voice. I loved the grooves. I just thought they were, um, I don't know, they were just different than the stuff that was in my house, and I loved it. I was really drawn to that, and so I would listen to these drum fills a lot and try to think about them. And it wasn't until a few years later that I came to play music. And I was 14 years old on my way into high school, and maybe I was 13. Um, it's a little while ago now. And a friend of mine, Kurt Windish, his father, said, "Hey, you guys are going to this school. No one else from your school is going to be going to this school. You guys aren't going to really know a lot of people like you have because you've been in the same elementary school and middle school for all these years." And he said, they're having this marching band meeting. Maybe you guys could make some friends and join the band. And me and Kurt sort of looked at each other like, okay, we'll give this a shot. And so we go to this meeting, and band director comes out and talks to everybody, and then he starts to divide everybody up, and he's like, okay, if you play the trumpet, you go over here. You play the trombone, you're going to go over there. Play saxophone, go this side of the room. If you don't play any of those instruments, went down the list, go with the drummers. So go back in this room with these drummers, and I'm just totally fascinated. They're getting out these sticks, they're playing all these rudiments and interesting, flashy things. And I just thought it was so cool, the sound of it, and just like how the dexterity and all those things. And so I just dove in. I got a pair of sticks. I practiced hours and hours every day trying to figure out how to play a drum roll. And finally got that together. And, you know, the first year that I was in the marching band, I played the cymbals. I marched around the field with a pair of cymbals. It was a little bit humiliating at times, but I was in the band, and then the next year I played snare drum. I got good enough through my own work to get onto the snare drum. And from there, I got a drum set and I started figuring out how to play songs that I really liked on the drums. Um, and after, as I was, getting a little older in high school, I didn't really have any designs on being a professional musician. Um, And even though I had been exposed to all these different types of music and styles of music, Louis Armstrong, Ella Fitzgerald, these records I had of my father's, the punk rock and like alternative music that I was listening to, um, and that my friends that skateboarded with me listened to, I just didn't really see it as something that I was going to do professionally. When I went to college to the University of Cincinnati, I first registered as a chemistry major. And I thought, well, maybe I'll be a doctor, maybe I'll be a surgeon. And one day, one of my friends that I had met in school, Aaron Almashi, he had a drum set at his house. And I asked him, hey, man, can I play the drums for a second? He was like, you don't play the drums. You don't know how to play the drums. And I was like, no, man, I played in high school. He was like, what? I've known you all this time. You didn't tell me. And I was like, well, it's been a while. He's like, okay, well, can you go play a beat or something? And so I played, and he was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this. Like, you can play, like, let's jam, and he gets his guitar out and starts playing. And then he played me a whole bunch of stuff, that I had never heard before, like late 60s Miles Davis records, Bitches Brew, and stuff later from his life, Miles Davis Live Around the World album. That was a bunch of live recordings with Kenny Garrett and great band. And something kind of flipped, and I heard music a little bit differently, and that fascination started to come back. And so then I joined a band. There was a jam band that was playing all this like 60s sort of acid jazz music, as it was categorized, I think, at the time. And really having a great time, and starting to think, maybe I want to be a professional musician. Um, and This great trumpet player who's from Chicago, who was teaching in Cincinnati at the time, Brad Good, he had heard me play, and he said, hey, why don't you come down to CCM and go to the music school there, the jazz program? And I was like, I think this is a great idea, but I still wasn't sure. And I remember a rehearsal with this jam band I played in called Ray's Music Exchange, um, where the saxophone player Josh Quinlan brought in a song, and he said, "Hey, this song is rubato," and I didn't know what that meant. He said, "Well, just try to follow the melody. Do you have any mallets?" And I was like, "I don't know, I don't have any of those." He's like, "Well, try to get some mallets, so we can play the song in the band. And here's this CD, John Coltrane's Live at Birdland. There's a song on there that's rubato called Alabama." So I go home and I put the CD on, and when I'm listening to the song, just can't believe um, how much this music is connecting to me on an emotional level. And when I learn what the song was about, and it was about the four schoolgirls that were killed in a bombing at a Baptist church in Alabama, I was so affected and moved by that I thought to myself, if I could ever um, write a piece of music that could reach someone and let someone know a feeling or a story, that I will have lived a great life. And I know that's idealistic and maybe in some ways a little misguided. Um, but that song really stuck out to me. And so over the next several years, I mainly only listened to the John Coltrane Quartet during these years, these formative years of me thinking about jazz music and improvised music. And Elvin Jones became my favorite drummer. I tried to emulate him, and I tried to honor the things that I heard him play. And in my pursuit of this, I started to realize this story of music in America and this lineage, this jazz lineage. And so the deeper that I got into this music, the more I realized that I needed to be, if I was going to be a part of this music, of Black American music, that I was going to need to make some connections to people that were part of the lineage. And so I began to seek that out. And one of my teachers, Art Gore, who played with Lonnie Smith, really started to let me know about why he played drums in a certain way and why the music felt a certain way. And there was just sort of a standard that had to be met with some of my teachers, Art Gore and Mark Fields. He required everyone. Mark Fields always required everyone to write music in his small groups at CCM. And I also connected with Jim Anderson, a great bass player in Cincinnati, who is one of my favorite bass players of all time. And he would tell me different stories of when he was going to Berkeley in the early days of Berkeley, living in Boston and playing all these great shows. And he often was the bass player that people would play when they went on little Midwestern tours and things like that, little regional tours. And he would be the bass player that these great musicians would call when they'd come to Cincinnati. And I started to realize that the more that I became connected with people on a human level, the more that I sort of started to become a part of this story too. And that's really important to me because this music, jazz music, improvised music, really is a lot about human connection. There is an undeniable thing that we all have to realize, which is that this music came because of the enslavement of Black people. And it's really important to know the history of this music and to be aware of what that means. When I practice this music, it's so important for me to honor the traditions and the legacies of these recordings and these musicians that made those recordings. So for me, it became very important for me to sort of try to figure out a way that I could take these things that I was learning and start to use them as a way to figure out how I was going to sound or what I was going to sound like, and not just copying, not just emulating. And I spent a long time emulating great drummers, Jimmy Cobb, Philly Joe Jones, Elvin Jones, Tony Williams, and many others, Art Taylor, Kenny Clark. But I didn't want to just copy that music forever. I wanted to do something else with my own ideas of what I liked and didn't like so much about different things that I heard on recordings. And I wanted to make music that was a product of all of the things that I liked. You know, Mitch Mitchell, you know, Ringo Starr, and then other drummers that I was friends with. And so I think it's really important to be aware of where you stand in this story of jazz and its lineage, and also how you can become more connected.
Just before your dad called me, I had a dream. All my dreams from people who have died all take place in my kitchen for some reason. So I was in the kitchen, and it was dark, and there was someone there with me. I knew it was someone I loved. There were no names exchanged. The face wasn't clear. I remember the black hair. And I remember saying, "It is so good to see you. I can't believe it. It's so nice to see you." And then I left the kitchen to go back upstairs. And on the way down in the car, I thought to myself, I wonder if that was Andrew stopping by to say goodbye to me. I truly believe it was him.
Okay, so the concept that I'm presenting today is breaking down the fourth wall. Now, I know that the fourth wall generally is something that's perceived in cinema or in plays in the theater, and it's usually comedic in nature, where someone speaks directly to the camera and lets you know that they know that they're in a work of fiction, and it's usually kind of a funny thing. Like, I think about Spaceballs, or some of these movies, Ferris Bueller, where this happens. Now, the way that I perceive this in music is I perceive that there is a thin wall between me, the musicians that I'm playing with, and the audience. And with instrumental music, oftentimes I see that as sort of an impediment to having my music be clear and understood. Now, I realize there are a lot of things you can do when you're writing a composition and performing a piece of music to let people know what that song is about and what maybe some of the feelings of that song are. However, that is not going to be enough for the music that I set out to write on my recent album, The Weather Up There. The Weather Up There is an album that I wrote to honor my brother's life. In 2008, he died tragically in a home invasion robbery in Cincinnati, Ohio. And as he was home after work, two men armed with AK-47s came into his house to rob him and his roommate. And at some point, the roommate saw a chance to escape. He ran out the side door. My brother tried to run towards the back of the house, and they shot him, with these guns, these assault rifles. And that event has been a huge trauma for me and my family and my brother's friends and people that have known me and have been close to me. And I knew that after it happened and things settled and there was a grieving period, I knew I always wanted to do something to honor my brother's life with music. And so even early on, just even in that year of 2008, I was sort of starting to try to figure out how I could write some music. But it wasn't until many years later. I moved to Chicago in 2009. I started playing music around Chicago with different people and just picking up different ways that people wrote music. And instrumental music has always been so fascinating to me. And I always had this thing that I wanted to write something for my brother. And so I was getting different ideas, different ways to play music, different ways to improvise, being exposed to all the great musicians and music being made in Chicago. But when it came time where I felt like I could actually do this, I could actually write a record, I originally set out just to write a record about what happened to my brother. And I was talking about this with my friend and a great drummer, and composer Mike Reed, and he said, "Are you really going to just write a record about the worst thing that happened to your brother? What kind of person was he? Who was he? Like." And I said, "He's a joyous person. He's fiercely loyal, and he would defend his friends, and protect the ones that he loved, and he always made people feel warm, you know." He's like, "Well, what are some of the memories you have of being kids?" And I had all these great memories of us dancing to Rolling Stones records, or my brother chasing our whole family with sand, like throwing wet sand at us on a beach somewhere in Florida, and all these great memories. And he said, "Well, don't you think you should put some of that into your record?" And that was such a great idea and concept, and it changed my whole trajectory. And then it became about, well, I need to tell my brother's story. And so how am I going to do that? How am I going to write this music? Um, and how am I going to convey these things that I feel about what happened to my brother, the type of person that he was, and how he was a victim to gun violence? How can I convey this only through instrumental music? And I just kept thinking, like, I've got to find a way to somehow break down this little thin wall, this fourth wall, to the audience, so that my music can be clear and that this story can be heard.
The police wanted me to come down and give a statement. They didn't want to tell me anything. So I was on the phone holding for almost 3 hours. And I kept telling them that I wasn't going to come down because I had the problem with my back. And it just fueled my senses that something had happened to Andrew. Something bad. I finally just came out and he said, "Well, just tell me. I already feel like he's dead. Just say if he is or not." And finally they did confirm that he was indeed dead.
So how can I tell the story of what happened to my brother? How can I tell the story of what happened to me and my family through sound, and break down this barrier so that I can be clear to a listener, to an audience? I started to develop a process. And the first thing that I did was I knew that I needed to organize my thoughts. And so I started to write down different things that I could remember of what had happened, how I felt at the time, different memories, and sort of like in a journal or in little poetic statements. And I started looking at photographs and trying to remember where that photograph was taken of me and my brother when we were kids, or, who might have been there, where we were, and maybe how that felt at the time. And I was just gathering all of these materials and thinking about all of this time that I had with my brother, and also staring right at this traumatic event in my life. And it was a tough period to go through that, but I knew that I needed to have a clear idea of how I was going to tell this story and how I was going to convey this to a listener through sound. And so eventually I got to a place where one night or an afternoon, I can't remember when it happened, but I sat down and I wrote a poem, kind of beginning to end. And I think that typically happens in things, as a side note, that if you start putting in a lot of work on something, whether it's writing music or in this case, gathering materials and organizing my thoughts, that as these things are floating around in your head, you're thinking about them day in and day out. Sometimes you can just sit down and write something and it all kind of comes out in one quick kind of flow. And that's what happened with this poem. So this poem is titled Turn the Tides, and it goes like this. I can't pretend that I'm whole anymore. I was split in two, and I imagine what must have happened. Andrew lying there on the floorboards, rivers running out of him, calling out for Mom and us. And then how strange it must have been. He breathes out, pushes himself up and out of his body, and then walks out the door of this world. It's been nearly 10 years, and I'm still half awake. I memorized the lines, the faces, to hold it all together, but it's nothing. I live in moments, warm Polaroids, that I keep close to tell the passage of time. I'm sleepwalking while the whole world is on fire. I've got to find a way to turn the tide. I've got to find a way to turn these tides. That poem says a lot to me about how I feel about what happened to my brother. And it also includes this dream I kept having about my brother after he was shot and was lying on the floor, and what happened to him. I had this dream that he was lying there and then he kind of pushed himself up, his spirit out of his physical self, and kind of looked around, took one last look, and then he walks through this door of light out of this world. And I talk about how, since this happened in 2008, how I sometimes feel like time is not very, very present, very real, because, you sort of just trudge through a trauma like that, and you do the best you can to hold it together. But there are many memories that I've had since 2008 that are beautiful. And so once I knew how I felt, it became very clear to me that I couldn't make this story just about my own reflection. I needed to include other people that were directly impacted by my brother's death. And so I interviewed my father, my aunt, my brother's best friend, my ex-girlfriend, people that were around at that time, my sister, that were directly impacted. And I sort of went through the same process that I had went through with them. I asked them what they could remember, how it's affected their life, what were some of the things that they remember about my brother before then, what were some of their favorite things, and just to get a clear picture. And I quickly realized that these things that people were saying were poignant and they were beautiful. And I thought to myself, well, maybe if I can find a way to use this with some of this music that I'm thinking about writing, maybe that can be a way to cut through this barrier and reach a listener that might not know what this music is about and inform them on what it's about, through these fragments, these little things. And so as I had gathered this material, and then I started to form this concept of how to use some of these interviews, these telephone interviews that I recorded, then I kind of was ready to go on to the next phase, which was sitting down and writing this music.
Those rivers run as thick as us. Call 'em, call 'em, call 'em. You call for us, and we still call for you. I got to find a way to turn the tide. Gotta find a way to turn the tide.
So I'd like to get into a little bit of how I wrote one of the songs on this record called He Pushes Up. That work I had talked about, the self-work, about gathering materials and eventually resulting in me writing a poem, Turn the Tides. In that poem, I talk about that dream, and I talk about my brother pushing up. And so that's what this song is about. He pushes his spirit up out of his body to leave the world. This song is completely instrumental. Yet, as a result of these collected interviews of my family, the poem, my friend Ben Lamargay singing some of the lines of my poem and making melodies with them, overturn the tides, and the different ways of these interspersed things. At this point in the record, I feel like the story has been told. The different compositions had coalesced into where I felt like me playing this song now as just an instrumental song is going to mean more to somebody than, hey, this is just a sad song. This song is about something that happened to his brother. And if you look at the title and make the connection to the lyrics, then you might know exactly what it's about. But it's a lot more clear because of all of these things that happened on the record prior to this song, and this song being what closes out the record. The way that I wrote this song started with an idea I had in 2008 after my brother died. And there was some chords that I had heard in a song a friend of mine wrote, this great piano player named Andrew Toombs. He wrote this song about this place in Canada that he really loves, McGregor Bay. And he had these beautiful major chords moving in a certain way, these major 7 chords. And I always liked that idea. And so I would play around with these ideas of this major 7. And that led to me sort of focusing on one note, which is a G. And I knew I really liked this sound of the G as a major 7. But how was I going to write a song with this idea. And so I just started playing just the G. I'd play the G out a little bit. So. And I'd start searching for different roots. And I eventually sort of settled on sort of this pattern. I knew I needed a little bit more. But what was it about this sound that I liked so much? What was it about this that was going to tell the story of this dream in sound? And so I kept thinking back to the dream itself and thinking about what happened to my brother and him lying there and getting ready to leave his physical body and move on from this world. And I knew that this sort of oscillating thing didn't really say it to me. Because this feeling of this big transition it's pervasive. And I knew I needed something that would speak to that feeling. And so I started just playing the roots of what I liked. And so I started here. And then I started to add some harmony up top to try to get this feeling, this pervasiveness, like a heartbeat, but it's slow, but it's still there. So there's that major 7. And that feeling started to take on the feeling that I felt inside and that I knew was there from the reflection I had done. And suddenly it wasn't just about my own reflection or my own loss. It was about the loss that my family felt. But I wanted to keep some mystery of what it was. And I started to feel like this song was going to break through and it would reach people if I could just stay true to the things that I felt and that I knew my family felt, about my brother. So as I wrote the song, I wanted to have this foundation with the roots kind of trudging along. Sorry. And I wanted there to be sort of a lyrical melody on top. And so I started to try to figure that out. And I knew that I was going to have Matt Ulery playing electric bass. I knew I was going to have Jeff Parker playing guitar on top, and that he would find a beautiful way to voice these chords. And I knew I'd have Josh Johnson playing the saxophone. And a lot of that informed how I proceeded with what I wrote on the paper. And I think it's important to know the people that you're going to play with and what you're going to share with them. Now, originally, I didn't tell my band what my music was about. I didn't want to burden them with sort of like the emotional weight of this story. And I just sort of thought, well, let's just play the songs. They'll pick that up that there's something going on, but I don't want to burden them with these feelings and this story. And so I put up a wall between myself and my band. Thinking I'm protecting them. But that really impacts the way a person plays if they really know what's going on. And so I had spent all this time trying to figure out how to tell this story to people that are listening, but I somehow, in the end, just didn't want to break through that barrier for my own band that would be recording the material. And eventually Jeff picked up on this and he said, "Man, what's this music about?" And I told him. And he was like, "That's really heavy. And you got to tell me this stuff because it affects the way that I play." And from that moment forward, I went back into the studio where we were recording. We were just about to record this song, He Pushes Up, and I told everybody what the music was about. And some of the things we re-recorded, some of the stuff hadn't been written yet, but this song, He Pushes Up, was recorded, and I think we just did one take of it. I think what you hear on that record is the first take. We had rehearsed it, but everyone played differently than they had rehearsed it immediately after I told them what it was about. And they kind of knew, I think, in various ways what the music was about, but not directly. And especially me saying it directly. And Jeff was absolutely right. And so I broke down that wall and let them into what was really going on with me and what I was trying to do then and there, because it wasn't about burdening them anymore. It was just about being connected and being vulnerable enough to let people know what I was trying to do and what story I was trying to tell. And I'm very grateful to Jeff and to Josh and Matt and Paul Bryan and John McIntyre for helping me through this process and being there to support me while I try to tell this story. I think as I talk about breaking down these walls, to be clear, one of the things that kept popping up throughout this whole process of trying to be heard when I'm telling this story is that human connection is always the thing that produces the most beautiful results for me in my music. Feeling connected to the people I play music with and trying to feel connected to people that I don't know that I'm playing music for and having that intention. Okay, so at the end of He Pushes Up, you hear that the saxophone and the drums are eventually the only instruments that are playing. For me, that compositional device is mimicking the heartbeat of my brother. And the lyricism in the solo that Josh is playing are sort of reflections and thoughts about this experience. Through his lens, knowing me, knowing this story, but reflecting that emotion um, and channeling that in different ways. Um, it's very heavy to talk about and sort of emotional because there's such a connection that I feel with Josh as a human being and as a musician. Um, and I completely trusted him with this idea, with the end of this song, the end of this album. Um, and the things he played were absolutely beautiful. And as he starts to fade, and he has a sort of a interesting pedal that he plays through that repeats backwards things that he had played, which sort of has its own sort of idea of reflectiveness. Um, the drums eventually just have like the toms with some mallets, and I play sort of a heartbeat on the bass drum. I think um, this moment for me sort of says what so much of my record was trying to say, which is, my brother has moved on, and I don't know where he is, but I'm hoping that by breaking through some of these walls and trying to tell this story and connecting with people, which is really what it's all about, is connection, that people can reflect. And I hope that this song is one of the things that helps people to reflect. So for me, this story was so important because of my stance on what I believe about assault rifles in this country, that I believe in gun reform, legislative reform that would take away these types of guns, AR-15s, AK-47s, and make them illegal and confiscate the ones that are still out there, and make it harder to buy guns the way that it is to, at least as hard as it is to get a driver's license. And that's why I wanted to tell this story, and that's why I needed to break down these barriers and try to connect with people, because it wasn't just about honoring my brother. It's about trying to make this country safer so that this doesn't happen to another person, that this doesn't happen to someone else's brother, someone's child, someone's mother and father. And I think the things we've seen just recently in the news, it's happens all the time. I mean, how many times has it happened in the last week? As young musicians and composers, your music and your voice can enact change. It can enact feelings. And you don't have to tell a story that is part of a political stance, or you don't have to tell the story of a traumatic event. Everyone has a story, and it could be a happy story. It could be a story about finding beauty in the world. It could be a story of anger. But I do believe that if you do some of the work that I've talked about that I went through, organizing yourself, gathering materials, and trying to think about how you can break down this wall between you and an audience and connect, that your music will have such a deeper impact. I do also believe, as a counterpoint to this, that you can write music just for music's sake, just because you think something is beautiful or it sounds cool or whatever it would be. And that's totally valid. What I'm talking about, this is not the only way to make music. People have been making music for a long time before I was here, and will continue to do so after I'm long gone. And art is personal, and it's your prerogative to make music on your own terms. this is just one way of thinking about it that I think about, that I'm trying to revise and refine. And I think along with that, you know, sort of just staying aware of yourself in space and time is very helpful to continually to make creative things. One thing um, that Jeff Parker told me recently, because I was telling him I had some writer's block, is he said, if you can just continue to make time to make things, even if it's not good, he's like, it just becomes a practice, something that you do every day. And oftentimes, when I look back on things that I've created and I thought that they weren't that great, they've turned into things that really were awesome. It sounded great. And I think that's something that, I think we can all benefit from, getting into the practice of just being creative and making stuff. It could be anything. Just write a few chords, write a drum beat, write a bass line. Simple, just find some time to do something creative and unique. And I think also, too, sometimes we can put things on ourselves that are a little bit, tough. We can make things a little tough for ourselves. And something that one of my best friends in the world, Mekhi McCraven, told me recently is something that he was telling his band on tour years ago, which is they were playing these big shows. All of a sudden, his music was really getting over. And, he would say, just let your suckiness shine. And, which is to say, hey, we've all done some work here. We've all prepared. And now it's just time to get out there and just let it go. See what happens. Because oftentimes, I've had this experience many times. You're in a studio and it's really about trying to get that magical moment. And sometimes you'll go back and you'll try to re-record a song over and over and over again and make it perfect, and it becomes like an etude or something. And even though it's perfect, and maybe you played this thing you wanted to play or didn't do this thing you definitely didn't want to do, it loses some magic. So those imperfections are important. I know this is a little bit off topic, but just wanted to share a couple things that I've been thinking about just in the last few days, that are helping me, move forward in my own creative process. I look forward to answering any questions you may have about my process, about who I am as a musician, about composing, about playing drums, whatever that may be. Thank you very much for your time, for tuning in, and listening to me and thinking about some of these ideas. And I wish you the best in all of your endeavors and your music making. And I hope to hear some of your music in the world very soon. Much love.